Okay, Brian Cunningham is your presenter today. Brian is the Floodplain Management Policy Coordinator for the Wisconsin Department of Natural Resources. Brian has statewide responsibility for managing Wisconsin's floodplain program by serving as a primary floodplain zoning policy and enforcement specialist for DNR. He also coordinates the state's national flood insurance program, the NFIP, and the community rating system, the CRS. Becky Roberts is your moderator today. Becky is a land use specialist with the Center for Land Use Education.
The same thing I had to do last time. I was my settings.
Yeah, but that was just.
She provides training and resources for local elected and appointed officials and staff related to community planning and land use decision making. Brian will start us off this afternoon.
All right. Thank you, Karen. Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for joining us for the third seminar and taking your time during your lunch hour to join us, and hopefully you learned something to take home with the rest of your staff. So I'm going to shut off my video to save on my bandwidth, and we'll get started. So some of the things we're going to cover today are the floodplain development review process. So once you get that application in, how do you handle it? Some common questions and scenarios that you guys see and that we see, and some sample forms and materials that you can use to help with your floodplain management process. So if you could, in your chat, just think of what is the purpose of reviewing an application in the floodplain. So we're going to try to do a little more hands-on today and a little more interaction with you guys to try to get a feel of your floodplain ordinance and what it takes to manage it. So if you could just throw in the chat some ideas, what do you think is the purpose of reviewing applications in the floodplain? So we'll get off to that start.
So if you haven't already located it, there's a chat box, usually at the bottom of your screen. It's labeled chat and it looks like a little text bubble. So if you'd like to go ahead and start typing in what you believe are some of the purposes of floodplain zoning, that would be great. And we actually do have one question that I'll go ahead and answer as you're doing this. There was a question asked if this seminar is eligible for APA or AICP continuing education credits. And yes, it is. Karen had already typed a link to our webinar resources page in the chat boxes towards the top. And if you go to that page, you can actually obtain credits, whether you are a certified planner, a certified floodplain manager, or a professional engineer. And so there's different forms to fill out for all three of those. And if you have difficulty finding any of that, feel free to email me directly. All right, so let me go ahead and start reading some of the purposes that have been typed into the chat box. So ensure compliance with minimum standards and maintain eligibility for the National Flood Insurance Program, verify compliance with applicable ordinance regulations, protect life and property, check for potential violations, prevent violations which can impact a community standing in the flood insurance program and access to flood insurance, meeting ordinance requirements, keeping the public safe, maintaining good standing with NFIP. So it sounds like a lot of you know your stuff, know your purposes.
Yeah, thanks everyone. Those are great because, when you're at the front counter dealing with the public, so, well, why do I need even to do this? So those are all correct answers. And, these are some of the items that are in the model ordinance that I'm sure that's also in your guys' ordinance. So just some of the things, to think about, why you do what you do besides just the National Flood Insurance Program. So great answers. Thanks, everyone. So, floodplain zoning in Wisconsin. So we have state and federal rules that are in your ordinance, and you guys are the ones who have the adopted ordinances and do the zoning process. So, no permits are issued from DNR or from FEMA when it comes to floodplain zoning. So, it's tough on you guys when, it's easy to do research. So someone will do research and say, well, FEMA says this, FEMA says that, the DNR says that. Well, you guys have to enforce what's in your ordinance. So it's important that the applicant understands that and that you guys are the permit authority. And there's a lot of items that you have to do to enforce your floodplain management ordinance. You're doing field inspections, you're doing violations, You're trying to set up a fouling system, substantial damage inspections. So there's a lot of stuff that it involves with the permit process. So as we mentioned in the other sessions, all development in the floodplain requires a permit. So you can want to look at your office and do you have a system set up that, catches all development? So, it's tough. Like, so for instance, as counties, they may have some townships that have zoning authority. Some are unzoned, some are under county zoning. They may have their own zoning. You might have city and village that you have a building department and they issue the building permit, the UDC permit. They might not, and you subcontract that out. How does that contract work? Does the UDC contract only cover new construction? Does it cover additions? How do you track that filling and grading job? That's the golf course is changing the stream or adding a crossing for their golf carts. How are you getting that permit for filling and grading? So there's a lot of challenges out there to catch all development. So it's important that you look at your permit process and do you have a process that catches all development for every different scenario? And then that's a tough ask. So when you do get that application in, you have to locate that property, and is it in the floodplain? And as we talked about before, this hatched area, you might have that hatched area where my cursor is, and that's where the floodway is. And then you have that light blue area, and that's the flood fringe. And then that yellow area is the 500 year. And then we have those letters with the cross sections. And what happens if you have an applicant that comes in and he has a pond back here on this cross section DD, and he wants to build that house overlooking his pond, and you have to have those discussions with them and see, is that area going to meet your ordinance? Is it going to have dry land access back there? Is he going to be able to put fill in the floodway without causing a rise? Those are some of the things that you're going to have to talk about and locate. And remember, your jurisdiction is only in the mapped area. So if they're building outside of the mapped area, then you're not reviewing your floodplain ordinance. You might have to also issue or review your zoning ordinance, your shoreline ordinance. So there's so many ordinances that you guys enforce, and you have to look at all of them on a case by case situation. So some of the things that you're looking at to when a land use permit comes in is you have to make sure that they have the lot dimensions on there, that they have the base flood elevations in there, and you have to figure out what district they're in. Are they in the floodway district or in the flood fringe? Then you can apply those requirements to those. And if it's in the floodway, you'd have the the H&H requirements. So these are just some of the examples of what you're going to need when that application comes in. The permit process. So, are you, what kind of, inter-office review process do you have? Do you have only one person that reviews floodplain? Do you have someone that, reviews that person's work? If you remember only one thing today, I would ask that you consider, if you don't do a checklist, really consider doing a checklist in your office. When I worked for Sauk County, I would say, maybe 10 years we did not have a checklist. And then the last 10 years we did have a checklist. And I can't believe the difference it made having a checklist. When you guys are reviewing a permit application, you get interrupted all the time. You have phone calls coming in, you have the counter traffic, you have all these situations coming at you. And it's hard to remember when you were reviewing that application, where you left off on that application. And another thing I found out too, by having that application, that checklist, you write notes. I'd say like this checklist here as an example. I think if you were to create a checklist, I would add a huge comment section. And that comment section can talk about all the things that were missing, the day you notified, the applicant, how you notified them, because all of a sudden, if that permit's in your basket and you're out in the field, someone else can take a look at that application and say, and when that contractor calls or the owner calls, and they say, what's holding up my permit application? And you don't have to be there because you might be out in the field, you might miss the phone call. It's just a efficient way to move that process along. And, and if that permit's held up and all of a sudden you're getting a call from the county board, chair or the village board committee member saying, well, why is that permit application in your office for a month? You can show, well, these are the reasons what we're waiting for or holding up. So this is really, and then being that floodplain is so complicated and you need so many different items with your permit application, I would really suggest that you take a careful look and create some kind of floodplain application. And another important thing I would say is that over-the-counter consultation, explain to them that, this is only a 100-year floodplain. Have you considered, what happens if if there's a 200-year flood event? Have you considered, flood insurance, the requirements of flood insurance, and just talk about those situations so they have all the information in front of them before they decide that, if do they want to move forward. It's really frustrating for an applicant if they're halfway through the process and then you tell them, oh, by the way, you have to do an H&H and it's going to cost $10,000. Well, maybe the project was this addition and it's not even going to be $10,000 for the whole addition. So, maybe they would have decided not to do the project. But if they find out halfway through the process, that's where people get upset. So if you know all your decisions up front, that it makes it a lot smoother process. And I would say another thing to remember, if you remember anything else today, is the issue of certificate of completion. When FEMA does an audit or the DNR does an audit and we look at your permit applications, this is one thing that's missing sometimes. So can you imagine 5 or 10 years later calling that person up and saying, oh, by the way, you have to hire a surveyor to do an as-built survey to show that the addition or the house was built to the plans that you submitted to us. So, it's in your ordinance that they have to hire a surveyor to do this. So it's, having that checklist or that process, because it's hard to remember, 2 years from now, what permit you issued and if they did that as-built survey and did you file that as-built. So somehow establish a system in your office to be able to come back and check those as-builts to make sure they have that certificate of completion. And we'll talk a little more about that later on. But those are just some of the things highlighted that I, when I work with communities that make a smoother process. I remember, we issued a permit in air and it went to the court system. And if you would have, if we would have had that checklist and the reasons, even the field work, like when you go on site and visit that site before you issue the permit and be able to put what you noticed out on this job site on that checklist, like, there's been filling and grading going on already, just to have that documentation, it really helps for the next person down the road too, that maybe, maybe pull that permit application to see, what's going on.
And Brian, I'd like to add here, we actually
Mhm.
included a copy of a sample checklist on the webinar resources page. So if people look by the webinar 3 underneath the presentation, there's some bullets. So we have sample permitting materials as well as that checklist.
Awesome. Yeah. So there's a lot of resources that Becky's put on there. So make sure you go through those and look at those examples to, help with your process. Thanks, Becky.
Mhm.
So these are just some of the examples that we talked about before of what you're going to be reviewing on your code. These are the higher standards. So we have, the 2 feet of freeboard. When you hear that freeboard, that means +2 over the RFE. Your permits require dryland access, and most of your ordinances prohibits, floodway development. And then in Southeast Wisconsin, that would be for any floodplain development, just not floodway. They treat the floodplain like floodway. And then we also have the cumulative improvement standard, that 50% rule that we talked about last time. You remember that 50% rule is for non-conforming structure. So if you have non-conforming structure, you have to do that 50% rule. The only time you don't is when the structure becomes not non-conforming anymore. When it becomes conforming, then you don't have to do it. But if it's still non-conforming, you have to do that calculation. So that permit application comes in. You have a permitted uses in your flood fringe ordinance, and these are some of the issues. These are some of the listed uses that are in your flood fringe. And for floodway, it mostly consider it like an open space use. You're prohibited. Most. I guess if you think of it, it's it's where the water is moving, so there's not too many structures that should be put in the floodway. And it's important that all permits or certificates have been issued and that meets your floodplain ordinance. And some of the open space uses, if you can think of it, like parks, golf courses, stuff like that. The floodway, this is a continuation. It should have low damage potential. It should not increase the flood elevations. And for the most part, there should be no structures, fill obstructions. The only structure that, really should be in the floodplain, you think of like a park shelter where you have like 4 posts and a roof, something that's not going to, back up flow, not going to be lived in. Those are about the only structures that really should be, that when you think about what should be put in the floodway, if you can, try to think of an example. And, some communities don't even allow that. So it's, totally up to you on where you want to draw that line. And again, some of the floodway basics, if that permit application comes in, are you requiring an H&H? Are you making sure that you're looking at a floor plan that doesn't have any human habitation? It should be anchored. And then the mechanical and utility equipment must be elevated to the flood protection elevation. And that's a +2 when you see the flood protection elevation. So, all right, today, here's an example where today someone comes into your office and fills out your application and submits this plot plan. So would you approve or deny this application? And what's going on here is we have an existing house and we have a proposed addition to the north on this on the north side here, an addition. And then we have also an addition on the east side of the house, on the southeast side where there's a patio area. And then we have a proposed boathouse. So we have a zone AE, so that's where the floodplain boundary is. So to the east is floodplain, and to the west, the middle of the house is outside the floodplain. We have an elevation. It says the lake, the 100-year floodplain is 1019, and we have a lowest adjacent grade 1018, lowest floor 1010, first floor 1020. So if you were to get this application, would you approve or deny? And is there anything else that you would want to ask for? So again, in the chat, go ahead and say that you would approve or deny this, or you would ask for more information. And what more information would you ask for? So when you say deny, like, why would you deny it? What more information would you ask for before you'd be able to make that decision to deny it or accept it? So what are some examples that if you were using your checklist or using your ordinance, what other things would you want to see before you would review this?
Brian, I'll go ahead and read some of the things I'm seeing pop up. So we see a deny with one of the questions being the freeboard. Another person suggested holding the application for additional contour data in regards to where the additions are going. Deny, again, because of contours. This person didn't say approve or deny, but requested more information on the H&H study and 50% rule.
All right, that's awesome. So you guys should be teaching the class instead of me. Those are all great
All right,
answers.
now they're coming through a little more quickly. So deny isn't the existing structure non-conforming. Deny, need more information on contours.
All right, so first thing is, to think about that, what floodplain zoning district is this? So it's talking about a zone AE, but they didn't tell us, is the east side of the house in the floodway or the flood fringe? So, that H&H would have to be done to see, is water standing here or is water flowing here? So we'd have to determine what district we're in, and then what district we're in, we'll determine how we want to treat this and what kind of flood proofing is going to be required. So first thing, like you said, we'd have to do an H&H to determine what district we're in. And then we'd have to know what the elevation of the addition is. So the new construction has to be, +2. So that new construction has to be +2. So anytime there's an addition, you treat it like new construction. So we need elevation data of these additions. Someone mentioned, is it non-conforming? So, that's great. Is this house non-conforming or not? Based on the elevation data, we have an elevation of 1019 and the lowest floor is at 1010 and lowest adjacent grade is 1018. So, these numbers are showing that it is a non-conforming house. So then if we have a non-conforming house, we have to find a itemized list of cost and go through the 50% rule. And we would also have to ask the applicant to provide the equalized assessed value of the house to do that 50% rule. One thing that if you do this a lot, that would catch your eye, if you remember from our webinar number 1, is this elevation of 1019. There should be a flag going off anytime you see a rounded number, because if you remember right in that squiggly line, like FEMA will have a squiggly line, and that squiggly line is a rounded number. If it's not a cross-section elevation number where you need to look in the FIS to get the actual number, and it should have a decimal point. So that to me would be a red flag that it should at least say 1019.0. So anytime you don't see a point, that should be a red flag that something's not right there. So those are all great answers. So we'll go to the next slide and just have a summary of some of the things that that they should be looking for. So what about so you had them go back out there and do the survey, but you didn't tell them that they had to do the boathouse. So they bring the survey in, and then as you're doing the application, going through the application, you say, oh, by the way, the accessory structure for that boathouse, the lowest floor has to be at the regional flood elevation. And the applicant said, well, you didn't say anything about surveying the boathouse. So you're telling me I got to go back out there again? And actually, you'd say, yeah, well, I got to go out there twice. And now all of a sudden you're going to say, well, by the way, you actually got to go out there 3 times because you have to do the as-built. So those are some of the things that by using a checklist and going through each structure, each addition, by telling the applicant ahead of time that, you're going to have to do a survey. The survey is going to have to do this structure and the addition and the boathouse. And by the way, this is in our ordinance where you have to do an as-built. By having that all up front, it makes it a lot easier process, because all of a sudden if that applicant is complaining to your supervisor or to the, like say, the county board chair, like, what's going on? Why is this applicant has to hire a surveyor to go on my property 3 times? So you don't, by having that checklist and going through that, hopefully, you can avoid those awkward situations. So this is some of the things that as that application comes in that we're just talking about. So this let's say this addition was in the flood fringe. You have to have that fill 15 feet around the house. Right here, the 15 feet has to go around the house. The addition has to have that plus 2 feet of freeboard. What else are you looking at? So some of this is just showing a picture of what's in your flood fringe. As it's listed out, this is just showing a picture of what's listed out and how it works. So in the flood fringe, you can build in the flood fringe, but you have to have the plus 2, and then you have to have that full of 15 feet of fill around the house, a foot high. And this is just showing an example of a picture of what your ordinance says. And again, this is talking about having that as-built survey at the end. So this is something that's in your ordinance that many communities forget to do, is having that as-built done. So that's important that when you have that conversation up front, that they're aware of that requirement. One thing I wanted to point out too, this first floor, a lot of people will talk about the first floor. There's really nothing in your ordinance that talks about first floor. Everything in your ordinance is lowest floor. What people talk about first floor is flood insurance. Flood insurance requirements look at first floor, but for floodplain management, you look at lowest floor. So I just wanted to point that out. FEMA is requiring, FEMA's they're in the process of having a new elevation certificate. It's not out yet, but you'll see this come in your office, and this can be used as your as-built. Most communities do not have this in their ordinance, that an elevation certificate is required, except for CRS communities. CR's communities require an elevation certificate, but the rest of you guys, for the most part, you don't have it in your ordinance that an elevation certificate is required. They can be used, for that as-built survey. Another thing to consider too is, if you're doing a stream bank project, stream work project, and you're issuing that floodplain filling and grading development permit, has the applicant gone through the Army Corps, U.S. Fish and Wildlife? Are there any federal, state, are there DNR permits required? So those are the other things, do you want those permit applications, from these other agencies ahead of time to make sure that the project's going to be approved before you issue it? So those are some other things, to check on and have that construction meeting, ahead of time and get all that up front. And this is just, talking about that pre-application conferences is so important to have those meetings ahead of time, get everything up front, show them the checklist, everything that's going to be required ahead of time, so there are no surprises during the process. And we already went through this slide. You guys did a great job. You realize that the structure is non-conforming. So we'll go through an example. Since the structure is non-conforming, we'll go through what you would have to do to be able to issue those permits for that addition. So you'd follow the 50% rule. So you need the cost of the improvement divided by the equalized assessed value would equal the percent of improvement of the cost. So if it's 50% or more, it's considered substantial improvement. And if it's considered substantial improvement, that means it's considered new construction and you're building basically, you treat it like it was a vacant lot. So what you do is you find that the assessed value in the tax records and you go to the treasurer's office and you just use the improved value. So use the assessed improved value. You don't take the total value of the property, just the assessed value of that structure. So if they have several different structures on the property, you're just using the one that they're improving on. And to get it to equalize assessed value, you have to use a ratio to make sure it's fair for everyone, because each township has a different has a different ratio. So you divide that ratio against the assessed value, and that will get you the equalized assessed value, and that's what you use for the value of the structure. So once you have that established, now you have to get an itemized list of the cost. And this is a diagram that's a little blurry, so I have spelled out in the other slides. But to determine costs, Becky did put examples of a list of itemized costs as attachments also. So these are, I'm not going to go through these, but these is for your resources. So if, as you get an application in for a non-conforming structure, you can determine, what you're looking for, what you're including, what you're not including. So for the most part, you have to include all costs. And I'll just touch on the items that you do not include, since that list is a little shorter. So like the permit fees, the plans, to draw it up, those are not included in the costs. Demolition costs associated with the cleanup and debris removal is not included. The structure fill to bring that fill in before they build is not included. Any plug-in appliances are not included, and any detached structures are not included. And your driveway fences, swimming pool, stuff like that's not included. So there's we have examples attached that will show, itemized list of what you want to include for those costs.
All right, well, we're going to go ahead and launch a little poll here. Pull this up. All right, so this question asks for you to complete the statement to make it true. This is a multiple choice. So building in compliance with the floodplain ordinance is required for new and substantially improved structures, reduces but does not completely eliminate flood risk, eliminates the need for flood insurance, or removes the structure from the mapped floodplain. And I'll give you a hint, there's actually two correct answers here. So we'll give you a few moments to go ahead and complete that poll. And related to the last few slides that Brian was talking about, when we're trying to calculate costs, I typed in the chat box, but again, if you visit that webinar resources page, there's some sample permitting materials from communities, and there's an example of a worksheet to help keep track of costs from Jefferson County. So that's a really good example to look at. All right, it looks like about 3/4 of you have participated. So I'll go ahead and stop the poll because it seems that you know the correct answers here. 96% of you guessed that first one. This is required for new and substantially improved structures, which is correct. And 86% of you guessed the second one, which is reduces but does not completely eliminate flood risk, which is also correct. So Brian, I'll let you take it from here. And I know you're going to go through a few of these points.
Yeah, so that's really high. I'm surprised that you guys answered it that high. Again, I think you guys should be teaching the class. That's really good because it's really confusing for people. So you have your flood fringe standards and people build, they go +2, so they're above the floodplain. So then why aren't they out? So you think about it as as a zoning district. If someone builds in a single family zoning district, it doesn't matter how high they build the house, they're still in a single family zoning district. And how you guys answered this is perfectly right. So you build that house +2 feet above the floodplain, they're still in the floodplain zoning district. And so what happens is after someone builds, then they you get a call from their bank saying, well, now you're going to have to pay flood insurance. And what do you mean I have to pay flood insurance? I'm 2 feet above the floodplain, but they're still in the mapped area. And so the structure is not removed from the floodplain, even though they're +2. And so this is a very confusing situation that happens out there. And so then a lot of communities aren't aware of this, but you actually have removal standards, a rezoning process in the beginning of your ordinance. And I'll go through that here. So sub A that's highlighted there, this is your rezoning process. So if you look at this really closely, your rezoning process and how to build in the flood fringe are a little different. The +2 feet is the same, but that +2 feet of fill has to go to land all the way outside the map floodplain. So you can't create an island, you have to create a peninsula. And you see there's no dry land access here requirement. There's no dry land access waiver requirement. Whereas in your flood fringe section on how to build in the flood fringe, it's a little different than how to remove yourself out. So not everybody's going to be able to remove themselves from the floodplain. And so that's and very important that when you have those pre-construction meetings, that you ask them, what is the goal? Are you trying to just build in the floodplain, or do you want to remove yourself from the floodplain? And so that's important that you ask those questions up front so they know. And I just wanted to point out sub C here. So 5 sub C, that is the Loma bill that we talked about last time, that Act 242. And that's just saying if you have a Loma, they are automatically removed from the floodplain. So they don't have to go through the rezone process. And that was, that was that Act 242. So just wanted, bring your attention to that. That's how it's written in the model. Just a little background, the mandatory purchase requirement, is just saying if you are in a map floodplain and you have a federal loan, you are required to have flood insurance. So, sometimes people don't realize that and they think, well, I'm building +2. They don't have to pay flood insurance. So it's a big surprise for them. And they'll come back to you and say, why didn't you tell me? Why didn't you tell me that was going to happen? So just by having that all up front, it helps with that process. Another thing that you get a lot of questions asked is why do I have to do an H&H? And so just wanted to touch on this. This picture was sent to me just like 6 months ago, and I think it was in the 2008 flood in southern Sauk County. What's really weird is that the same day I was at a graduation party about 10 miles north of this picture, and I saw the same thing happen where it started flooding. The cows got nervous and they tried to cross the river and they got sucked underneath the bridge. So I saw the same thing happen 10 miles north on the same day. So it just kind of hit home when I saw this picture sent to me. Some of the common reasons why you're going to require an H&H that you see often are, snowmobile bridges, road crossings, culverts, road projects, stream realignments, site gradings, these are, some of the reasons that, you require that H and H. What is an H and H? So it's the hydraulic analysis. And it's using a modeling system called HECRAS. And what it does is it delineates where the water is moving versus where the water is standing. And that's how you come up with this floodway, flood fringe. And it also give you the regional flood elevation. And again, as we talked about this in webinar 1, is that the hatched areas where the floodway is. So in the floodway, if you're in the floodway or you don't know where the floodway is, you're going to have to do that H and H to determine where that district is. If you're in the flood fringe where the water's standing, you won't have to do that H and H unless for some reason there's a few exceptions to that. Like let's say you have a zone A stream flowing into a zone AE, then you might have to do an H and H. But for the most part, when you see a flood fringe, you do not have to do an H and H. And just wanted to show, where is this coming from? This is just for your resource here. I'm not going to go through this, but this is federal code talking about H and H analysis. This is state code talking about H and H analysis. So if you just remember, like, when is an H and H required? It's for when you do not know what floodplain district you're in. You don't know where your floodway is, where that water is moving. If you're in the floodway and they want to add fill, that's when an H and H is going to be required. And if you have questions, like you shouldn't always just say an H and H is needed, and you shouldn't always say one's not needed. Work with your water management engineer, and you guys have been doing a great job since these webinars. Our water management engineer said they're getting more phone calls from you guys. So that is awesome. So, we're here for a resource, and H and H is really a confusing topic, and we don't have the modeling background, and we don't have the access to these models. So just don't tell an applicant, yep, you have to do an H and H. Reach out to your water management engineer and find out if an H and H is required, because they're not always required. Sometimes we can look at the model, if we have detailed plans and show what's actually happening, we can make that decision and help you with that process. And, we get questions all the time. How much do they cost? I've seen them cost $3,000 and I've seen them cost $30,000. So it's important that you tell, applicants to, get more than one bid, get 2 or 3 bids, and, use consultant firms, engineering firms that are used to doing this process, and ask them, for some references. And by doing that, they'll hopefully get a cheaper cost. And it just depends, on the project and what's going on and how much they cost. One thing I wanted to let you guys know of is that FEMA, when you get a LOMA, and we'll go through what a LOMA is in just a sec, but letters of map change used to be sent by paper copies to you guys. And FEMA is no longer submitting paper copies of letters of map change. So it'd be important that you guys sign up for this subscription here to get notified if you have a LOMA in your community of what's going on. Like a LOMAR, you'll still be aware of that situation, but for a LOMA, they are no longer submitting that. So if you want to receive copies of letters of map change, make sure that you sign up for the subscription. We just wanted to touch on letters of map change. So letter of map change is an example here. It's not just the only example, but if a person thinks that, they have been mapped in the floodplain by mistake, they can ask for a letter of map change. And that's, what a LOMA is. So a LOMA does not, it changes the map by letter. It's not going to put a little tiny circle on the map. You're not going to get a new map. It's just changing the map by a letter. And what it's used for land that is naturally higher than the floodplain elevation. So you can't use fill to use a LOMA. So it's just for natural ground that as these maps become more accurate over time, they're going to get more detailed. If you have a contour system in your community that has only a 10-foot contour system, those floodplain maps are not going to be as accurate as a 1-foot or 2-foot contour system. So as we get better data out there, the maps are going to get more accurate. And then we have the LOMAR, CLOMAR. So a LOMAR is in a CLOMAR they mean the same thing, the letter of map revision, except a CLOMAR is a conditional, and that's before the project. So when is a CLOMAR required? So it depends again what zoning district you're in and what's going on. So if you have a zone A, and the zone A, remember, we don't know what the elevation is, and we don't have a flood fringe and a floodway. So in that case, you look at, if you're going to, that project, they're adding fill into that floodplain, and if it causes a foot or more rise by doing that H&H, before you can issue that permit, they have to go through a CLOMAR process and get approval from FEMA. And then in an AE, where we know that AE, remember, we have an elevation and we have a floodway and a flood fringe for the most part, not always, but we have that figured out where it is, but we do at least have an elevation. Then there can be no increase at all. So that if you have any increase, then a CLOMAR would be required. And you just can't look at increases. You also have to look, is the map changing? Is the width of that floodway changing? And if it's changing so that you need new maps to have you guys have accurate maps by 5% of the total width, then a CLOMAR would also be required. And once a CLOMAR is issued, then you can go ahead and then issue the permit for you guys. And then once that project is done, then that project would be applied for a LOMAR, and that LOMAR would just show that it was built to plans. And once you have that LOMAR, then that is actually official change. There's been an official change to that FIS, that great big book, or to the maps. And that will be officially adopted because you guys enforce floodplain maps. So then that map would be adopted in your ordinance as a class 2 notice process. And it's important to remember that, just because someone's, remapped doesn't mean that they might not have to pay flood insurance anymore, but it doesn't, mean that they're going to be automatically safe from flooding. As I think we talked about in webinar 1, depending on what state you're in, FEMA issues 25 to I think 48% of their claims to outside the map floodplain. So it's important that the owner realizes that flooding does happen outside the 100-year floodplain. LOMAR Fs, we're going to touch on a little bit. A LOMAR F is when you add fill to the flood fringe. So if you're adding fill to the floodway, that needs a LOMAR application, and a application to the flood fringe is a LOMAR F. And a lot of times an applicant will give you the wrong form. So there's something called a community acknowledgement form, and a lot of times they'll give you the wrong one. So if you remember anything else today besides having a checklist, establish a checklist, do not sign these community acknowledgement forms until you work with your local water management engineer, because these are confusing. We'll check to make sure they actually submitted the right community acknowledgement form to you. FEMA has what they call an MT1 application and MT2 application. So we'll double check to make sure that that they applied for the right one, and that they're meeting the removal standards from your floodplain, and then we'll just go through that process. So just don't sign those, because when you sign those, you're taking on the liability, and it says that this property is reasonable safe from flooding. So before, you just want to know what you're signing, so we'll help you through that process. Why does FEMA have these community acknowledgement forms? They just want to make sure that they're following your ordinances, that they took out the right permits before they applied, and that it does meet your ordinance. So this, you don't get too many of these, but if you do get one, just if you just remember, just don't sign it until you work with us, and we'll walk you through that process. So I think I went through a lot of information fast. You guys did really good on answering the questions, and we can go through some of the questions I haven't answered yet.
Thanks, Brian. I've been tracking the questions, and there's a lot of good ones in there. So I think I'll start with some of the more recent questions that you just handled, and then we'll work our way back towards a couple that have even been answered in the chat. So
Okay.
One was the most recent clarification. So to clarify, a CLOMAR for a floodway width reduction would be required only if that reduction is greater than 5% of the total width.
Correct.
Then I'm gonna group two questions together because I think they're getting at the same thing. I'll ask the shorter version of this first. Is a full H&H always required, or can a statement from a licensed engineer stating that there will not be an increase to the BFE suffice in some situations?
Yeah, just a statement will work in some
Okay.
situations. Yep.
Okay, so another person had asked, and I think this would work here, but if you could clarify as well. Is there any way to get around the need for an H&H in a floodway or zone A for a simple set of stairs or walkway for access to the waterway? So this person gets permit requests quite frequently and feels they need to deny them due to the H&H requirement, as they've been told by DNR staff, and have had engineers quote them $20,000+ for the analysis. So it doesn't really make financial sense. Is this a situation where they could have that statement from the licensed engineer that you just suggested? Or is this
Yes,
something
right.
different?
So,
Okay,
right. So it's like the really H&H is always case by case. So like for stairs, for example, if they would match the grade, then if you're matching the grade, then an HH would not be required. If it's not matching the grade and they're going to extend it out, are there stairs on a river system? Is it on a lake system? Are there stairs close to an inlet or an outlet? So those are some of the things, get detailed plans and, have in a cross section and get all that information ahead of time and then submit that to your water management engineer. And those are some of the things that they're going to look at.
okay. So case by case on this one.
Yep.
Okay. All right. So another question was, where the road is below the regional flood elevation, can a permit be approved where the property has driveway access to a public right of way that local emergency services has stated that they can provide services with a wheeled vehicle during a flood event?
Yeah, so what you want to look at there, so how to build in the flood fringe is what we're talking about here. So how to build in the flood fringe, you have to have the +2 feet, then you have to have that fill 15 feet around the structure, and then you have to have dry land access. And then there's two exceptions in your ordinance usually about the dry land access. So if you don't have that driveway up to the BFE or the RFE, what you can do is you can get a waiver from emergency response. So as long as you get all the emergency response, police, fire, ambulance, if you get those all signed off, you can issue that permit. And if there's another option too in your ordinance that says you can have some kind of evacuation plan approved from the DNR, but basically they're hand in hand. We can't sign off on that plan unless all the emergency services sign off on that plan. So it's more communities use that more often. There's not too many. I think it's only happened like 3 or 4 times when a community submits a plan to us. And it's for, like 2 or 3 roads in a subdivision versus just making each separate landowner going through that same process. So the police, fire department are signing off on these, every time there's a permit application, but really they're the same thing. So if the emergency response can get there, and then I think it says it by wheeled, but I'd have to look, but I think it says by wheeled vehicle, then yes, you could be able to issue that permit.
And that was the scenario presented by this person. So
Okay.
another related question, and perhaps you've answered this already. If new construction is proposed out of the floodplain, but has to cross the floodplain to access, does this require dry land access?
No, it does not. So again, so you're only enforcing your ordinance. So your ordinance is the mapped area. So if the house is not mapped, then you can't apply your floodplain ordinance to that area of that house. Now, the filling and grading that goes into that driveway that crosses that floodplain, that's development. So that area would have to be enforced in your ordinance. You can give them the heads up that this is a 100-year floodplain. How are you going to get out and access your house, during a flood, and give them the heads up? But there's, nothing legally in your ordinance that would require dry land access for a structure that's built outside the floodplain.
Okay, one more question. What exactly is needed for replacement of an existing wing wall and bridge deck in the floodway?
A wing wall and a bridge deck, what would be needed? That again, would, case by case, and I would have you work with the water management engineer on that. They would
Okay.
know, be able to pull the model and see what would be needed. So I would have them work with their WME and see what would be needed on that. They would know better than I would.
Okay, let me go over 2 questions that were answered in the chat box, but just in case people haven't seen those. So one person was commenting on the Wisconsin cumulative 50% requirement. Shouldn't there be a checklist? Shouldn't the checklist also include a field to help track the 50% for non-conforming structures? And so actually, I did take a look back at the sample checklist that's provided, and it does have a field for that where you can enter in the values and you can help track as you progress towards that 50%. I don't know if you want to add anything to that at all, Brian, or if any best practices
Just
there.
that, when you do a non-conforming 50% rule, just make it really clear on your permit application what the ended up percent used to what it is. So each time you'd use the percent. So I would say the first time they do an addition, they used up 30%. Just make it really clear that they used up 30%. And just keep track of the percentage. Don't worry about how much value or how much money was each time, because the property value is going to change over time. So it's important that you keep track of the percent and not the value, because that's going to change. So it's important that you didn't say that, that the permit says, $100,000 addition was here. Well, that doesn't mean anything. It's the percent that means anything. So just always keep track of each percent each time you do it.
All right, so also related to the substantial improvement and substantial damage calculation, one person had asked if labor costs are included, and this was answered by Will who's from DNR, who said, yes, labor costs are included. This is true even if the applicant performs the labor themselves or is getting labor for free or at a discounted rate from friends and neighbors. In these cases, the labor cost must be estimated. Did you want to add anything to that, Brian?
Yeah, that's true. And, so it's tough. So what I usually, it's tough because I say, well, I got my 2x4s donated, someone gave me these 2x4s and my friends are doing the work. So, I'm basically putting the shed up for, $500. And so what you have to do is you have to tell them, you have to use revalues, what it would cost, to buy that lumber in the fair market labor. And what I used to do is, try to get some bids from contractors, how much does it cost to do an addition? How much does it cost to put in heating and cooling? How much does it cost to build a shed X square foot, and get some numbers to work with and see if you're close. And if they want to appeal your decision, that's why you have your board of adjustment set up where they can appeal that decision. But your numbers aren't hardcore and their numbers aren't hardcore. But if you guys get to a situation where you can't agree, and treat everybody fair and do it the same way, and then you just would have to ask them to appeal your decision, if you couldn't come to a compromise. But those are some of the examples where you can show them your numbers, and you can kind of go back and forth there and just try to treat people fairly there.
So I just had another question that asked, how do you track improvements that do not require a local permit, such as new siding, new roofing, etc.?
Yeah, that's the challenge part. FEMA requires that is under the definition of development. So that technically should be getting a permit. That is development in the floodplain and would require a permit. So that's what makes it really challenging. Are you going to catch every re-siding job out there? No, you're not. But what you have to do is that when, let's say they are going to do addition, it's important that at that time you ask all the questions like, well, since you're doing an addition, are you re-roofing the roof? Are you re-siding? And it's important at that time that you include all those costs, because if FEMA, they'll look at Google Earth, they see how houses are improved, and those, people that have had audits done, CAVs, community assistant visits, they'll look at that and see that. And they'll ask you, well, why didn't you include all these other costs? So it's important that when a permit is issued, that all those costs are included.
Great. So earlier in the webinar, Mia had included a statement in the chat box that I just want to read here. And I've also seen some really compelling graphics that kind of help get this point across. But she wrote, a 100-year flood event could happen up to 4 times in a 30-year mortgage. So a 100-year event or 100-year floodplain equals a 1% chance of that event happening in any given year, not once every 100 years. I think that's just a compelling way of thinking about it. A lot of times people will put this in terms of how frequently this is likely to happen in a 30-year mortgage.
Right, yeah, just another way to explain it. When you're at the front counter and talking about 100-year floodplain, you might not get, anybody's attention when you're saying, 1%, 100-year. But if you can say you have a X% chance of during a 30-year mortgage, that kind of hits a little closer to home, because most people are taking, a mortgage out. And if you have a, whatever it is, 30% chance to, have damage done to that home during a 30-year, process, it does seem to hit home the best. We've struggled with the way to describe the 1% chance, and that seems to be what hits home the best.
Yeah, this is Mia. I threw that in there when you were talking, Brian, about just things to make sure that you convey when you're at the counter with citizens of the community. And this is a point that helps illustrate the need for flood insurance, the benefit of it. That's why I put that there.
Yeah, no, thank you.
Then I just had one more clarifying question. Is the replacement of a roof a project that goes towards the 50%, or is it considered maintenance and not included?
So this is a great question. So NR 116 Wisconsin has 50% rule, and you keep track. You keep track of the improvements that we went over today, but then you have that 50% of cumulative costs, and there's over the life of the structure. So you're keeping track of that percentage. And because it's a cumulative, there's some exceptions. So maintenance is exempt from that cumulative rule. So let's say you have $100,000 house and you're doing a roofing. So you have to, by definition of development, they need a permit for that re-roofing. But let's say it's a $20,000 roofing job. So you do the calculation, it's 20%. 30 years later, they do it again, it's another 20%. And 30 years later, they do it again, it's another 20%. The intent of NR 116 was not that the third time you do a roofing job that you're over 60% and now that structure has to be conforming. That wasn't the intent. So there's a maintenance exception. So if it's in kind, a roof to a roof, shingles to shingles, siding to siding, that does not count against the cumulative 50% rule. However, FEMA does not have maintenance exemptions. So that's why you still have to keep track of it. But what FEMA does not have is they don't have a the cumulative rule. They look at it per project, per permit. So that's why you still have to keep track of that cost and show that roofing job did not go over 50%. So that's why you almost need two calculations. You're calculating the state cumulative 50% rule, where that roofing job would not count against the cumulative rule, against the cumulative 50% rule. But the FEMA rule requires you to keep track of that, because if that roofing, which is in kind, and that siding and that plumbing and the electrical and all that, they do all that at once and basically have a new house in the same footprint. And if that goes over 50%, even though by definition it's all maintenance, that house would have to be conforming.
Thanks, Brian. And there was a comment in the chat from Sarah talking about how she tracks every improvement in a calculation for FEMA, since they do not have exceptions for maintenance. And then she has a different calculation for DNR, which includes all improvements, but maintenance does not count towards the 50%.
Yeah, Sarah's turned into an expert in this. So contact Sarah, because she's doing a great job with this now.
Good. Well, let me end with one last question that relates to training. So Colette had asked, is there any benefit to attending the 4-day FEMA EMI training, or is there a Wisconsin equivalent?
Right. So there is like a scholarship where you can go, they do that training. There's online versions, and you can actually go to Maryland and go to the EMI building. And I think everything's paid for, your trip there, your meals. It is a great class, but The only reason I would not recommend it, taking it out east or online, is because I'm not there saying, oh, by the way, you have to follow the NR 116 Wisconsin rules. So it adds confusion when they're just talking about the NFIP minimums. They're going to talk about the 50% rule. They're not going to talk about the cumulative rule. They're going to talk about substantial improvements. They're not going to talk about the equalized assessed value. So they're going to say that a structure has to be at BFE, not BFE +2. They're going to say that a structure can be built in the floodway where your ordinance says you can't. So you just have to be careful of all those extra rules that are there. So I'd recommend, we just did the class last year in Southeast Wisconsin. And if I'm there after FEMA's done talking, then I can say, oh, by the way, don't forget about this, this, and this. So I would say try to take the class in Wisconsin. So then you get the Wisconsin version with the federal rules. The federal rules by themselves, it's still great to understand like how to map, like how to use the FIS and how to use those cross sections and how come up with the BFE. That alone is worth going to that class and doing that exercise. So I would, recommend going no matter, going when you can. And we don't offer the class, every other year, just because we want, at least 20 people to sign up when we do it, because it is a 4-day commitment. So I don't know if I directly answered that by saying yes and no, but I guess I would say yes, do it, just so you can learn how to do the FIS and come up with the BFE. And if you ever want to take the test of being a certified floodplain manager, that test is just on the NFIP requirements. It has nothing to do with Wisconsin standards. So for those two reasons, I would say, yes, go ahead, take the class, but just remember, you're going to get a little bit confused because they're not going to talk about Wisconsin standards. And, I'll try to get with FEMA to offer that class somewhere in Wisconsin again also.
Yeah, and I just might add to what Brian's saying, that if you subscribe to the DNR Shoreline and Floodplain newsletter, we put the upcoming trainings in that. I can get a link to you, Becky, on how to sign up for that.
Yeah, we can post that directly in the webinar resources page. I know where to find that one. It's a great resource. A couple of follow-ups on that question then. Do you have an estimated cost or recollection of what the NFIP training costs in Southeast Wisconsin? And then also asking if we could get together 20 or so individuals, could we get the training scheduled sometime with you this year, Brian?
Yeah, if we could. I have to put it in the grant before the grant is due in a couple of months. So we'd have to act fast. But yeah, if we could get 20 people committed and a location picked, I could put that in the grant and see if FEMA would come. So that is a great point. We just have to act on that now. So I don't know if that's a survey we could send out and find 20 people and find a location. Probably ideally it'd be central Wisconsin, just because then we may be guaranteed to get the 20. But I know northwestern part of the state has asked that we go up there, since we just went to southeast. Now it would just be fair if we went northwest, the opposite side of the state. But because it is a FEMA training, and the person that would do the training is actually leaving Wisconsin, is taking a job out east at FEMA headquarters, might not be able to do it, just because I don't know how quickly they'll be able to replace that person that would do the training. But that's something I can definitely look into if there's interest in, and put it in the grant to get it. The southeastern cost, that was just your hotel stay. So if we do it in state, the class itself is free, but you'd have to pay for travel to get there and to stay overnight. But if you do it out east, I know your stay is free, the session is free, and I believe there's reimbursement for your airfare too.
Great. Well, there's some chat activity where they're arguing about location. So it seems like there's interest. I can save the chat so I can track who's interested, but certainly also reach out to Brian or myself if you have an interest in additional training, whether it's the NFIP formal training or if it's some of these basic sessions, and we can see what we can do to get that scheduled. So I think we're going to leave it there for questions. We're just a little bit over time. For those who are able to stay on, we do have that last voluntary set of demographic questions that we use for reporting purposes. But also, I would just like to thank all of you for joining us for this 3-part webinar series. And I would encourage you to check out that webinar resources page because there's a lot of great resources there. And then also reach out to both Brian as well as your regional water management engineer.